Thank you very much, Chancellor Zimfer. There are a lot of people in New York who would like to forget what team Bill Russell played for as well, but cover that another time. Our next two speakers are both well-known and highly respected experts in the area of state and local government finance. We have asked Kim Rueben of the Urban Institute to outline potential budgetary solutions for states with a focus on the expenditure side of the ledger. Dr. Rueben is a senior research associate in the Urban Institute's Income and Benefits Policy Center and in the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, where she currently directs the state and local program. Her research has examined state and local tax policy, fiscal institutions, and issues of education, finance, and economics. Kim Rueben has also been on the research or academic faculty of the Public Policy Institute of California, the Georgetown Public Policy Institute, and the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley. And she has been a visiting scholar at the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. Ronald Snell, director of the State Services Division at the National Conference of State Legislatures, will serve as discussant for Dr. Ruben's presentation. In his position, Ron Snell oversees NCSL's principal state legislative support programs, including the Fiscal Affairs Program. And in his more than 20 years as a key member of the NCSL staff, Ron has published numerous articles and papers on state fiscal affairs, budget processes in state legislatures, state public retirement policy, and other issues. Please join me in welcoming Kim Rueben and Ron Snell. And we'll ask them to.
Do I need a clicker? Or do you want to do? Well, thank you for having me here. When I originally talked to Bob, he told me I was going to come up with budget solutions, and I thought, okay, that would be an interesting thing to do at this point, think about the long term and what the solutions could be. And I thought about it for a while, and it was a much more exciting thing to think about and maybe come up with answers 2 months ago when we first talked about it, then as it got closer and closer. And then over Thanksgiving, I looked and it said, oh, I'm supposed to talk about the challenges in state local expenditures. And I thought, okay, well, maybe we're doing solutions in the afternoon. And that gives me something to be grateful for, because it's much easier talking about what the challenges are than to actually figure out what the solutions will be. I'll do a little bit of that, but we'll see how far we get. So what am I going to do today? How bad is the current, what I'm going to talk about today is how bad is the current situation. Most of you probably know this better than I do. What do we spend our money on? What we think long-term expenditure pressures are? What is a long-term outlook, and are there solutions? That's a little pessimistic. I'm going to say yes, there are, but you all might be smarter than me and come up with them and better solutions. I'll just raise some questions. So if we go back to the 2007 General Accounting Office estimates of long-term fiscal gaps, they estimate that for state and local governments to stay in balance, they would have to either raise taxes by 17% or cut spending by 14% to keep operating budgets in balance through 2017. So this was basically before the recession that we're currently in, and this is largely being driven by their estimates of healthcare costs and Medicaid. They do assume that other state and local government spending actually declines as a percent of GDP, and so they are more optimistic than I personally am in terms of what the long-term pressures might be for states, in that they assume that other spending that's not healthcare will actually decline over the next 50 years. And it's not clear to me that there isn't pressure to increase spending on pensions, prisons, schools, and infrastructure, especially infrastructure if you think that we've been underinvesting up to this point. So let's talk about the current budget problems. They're expected to continue for the next 4 to 5 years. It's not clear we're going to come up with long-term solutions until we deal with our short-term solutions. Ideally, we could segue into being on a more sustainable path. To date, the NCSL is assuming a $382.8 billion gap. The CBPP gap is bigger, You'll notice I'll be stealing things from everybody else who's coming after me. That's another advantage to me going first. Part of what states have been doing is balancing the budget through either pushing some of their requirements into the future through borrowing explicitly or through implicit borrowing through paying, say, the last quarter of salaries into the next budget year. Part of this is understandable if you think about the size of the budget gaps we're talking about. But if we get into a situation where we do too much of it, it's not clear how we then budget for the future and deal with the structural deficits we know are there. This is a map of CBPP budget gaps for 2010. Over half of states had budget gaps of over 20% of their general fund budgets. So it's just basically illustrating the fact that this is a big problem. It's pretty pervasive. There are only 2 states that didn't have a budget gap in 2010. And as the economy basically got worse, more and more states ended up finding that their budgets were out of balance. Revenues declined first, which is a large part of what was going on with the budget shortfalls. But something that states are finding now is that even though they're cutting spending, those spending cuts don't necessarily stick. There are some automatic stabilizers and expenditures that are going to lead to more spending even if you make cuts. Colleagues of mine at the Urban Institute have estimated that for every percentage point increase in unemployment, it would increase Medicaid and S-CHIP enrollment by 1 million people and cause about a 1% increase in costs. So if we think about the 4% unemployment rise, that's about a $5.5 billion increase in Medicaid and health care due to economic conditions. If you think about part of the federal stimulus in ARA was not to change eligibility requirements, that means that states, even if they want to cut some of the healthcare spending, might not be able to if they want to maintain their federal money, at least in the short term. Some of the structure of higher education, we know that states have actually cut, I think over 35 states have made cuts to higher education, and tuition is going up. For some states that have automatic enrollment information and spending for financial aid, that could be a specific driver where you can have some automatic increases. K-12 education, most of this is done by policy. But again, I think some of the budget stabilization money means that you have to maintain some of your education spending. Pension liabilities. This is the big one. Basically, what we've just seen is the stock market go down, and yet there are liabilities on the book to retirees and soon to be retirees, and state and local governments are going to have to make up that money. Some of it might be able to be recovered as the stock market improves, but these are things that are going to have to increase. The other thing that's interesting that's going to be a strain on general fund budgets are there are certain debt payments and interest payments that can't come out and that need to come out of general fund revenues. For example, unemployment insurance loans. So the fact that the federal government basically issued loans to unemployment insurance funds, the money to pay back those loans, if there's interest charged, cannot come out of the unemployment insurance funds themselves. So that's money that's going to have to come out of general fund revenues, at least in California. Basically, states have actually made more cuts and increased taxes more. This is using NASBO data than in the past. The budget cuts, I can only go back to 1986, where the revenue changes go back to 1979. The absolute dollars, these are in real dollars. The numbers are higher. It is not necessarily higher as a percentage of general fund budgets, but it's just to show that states are actually taking action and they're going to have to take more. So that's where we are right now. So something to keep in mind is in 2007, state budgets were $1.4 trillion. A little under half of that was coming from general fund budgets. I think a lot of when we talk about balancing our budgets and what we're doing, we focus on general funds, but a quarter of the money is coming from federal funds, and then about another quarter is coming from other state funds, and 3% seem to be from bonds. So expenditure and revenue growth. If I'm going to focus on expenditures right now, the thing to notice is that we have actually found expenditures grow on a per capita basis. They've grown about 82% from 1980 to 2007, and 16% from 2000 to 2007. State revenues increased slightly more in the earlier periods since the basic stock market crash in 2000. Local governments have been making up a lot of that spending and revenues. I think it's useful, and this was said earlier, to think about state and local budgets in conjunction with each other, because when we talk about the services that we're providing, a lot of this can vary across different places, and it also isn't really a viable solution if part of the solution is pushing spending responsibilities or taking money away from local governments that don't have an ability to backfill that money. In the last recession, states did this, but because of the housing boom, local governments were actually having more money come in, so it wasn't necessarily a devastating thing to do to shift some of the responsibility back to local governments. This time around, I don't think that's going to be feasible. If you think those numbers are high, if you look at it instead of on a per capita basis as a percent of personal income or GDP, there's been some growth in state and local expenditures, but it's smaller. It's been about 17% from 1980, and state revenues have grown about 20%. Most of this growth has actually been before 2000. So over the last few years, there actually has been less growth in expenditures. So this is something most people probably know, but I think it's worth pointing out that half of state budgets actually go to education, K-12, and higher education, and Medicaid. So when we start talking about making cuts on the order of 20%, you can't do that through firing state workers. You can't do that through cutting along the edges and actually have things work. So basically, when we talk about where the cuts are basically in part going to be where the money goes and where the people are. So if we look at budgets over time, total revenues have grown from about $500 billion, $578 billion, to $1.4 trillion. Most of that the growth has been fairly consistent. Education has sort of maintained the same share. Medicaid has grown a lot, from 11% of funds to 21%, and corrections has gone up. There's been a slight decline recently, but if we think about where there are expansions, those are the places that we're expanding in the state budget. Where are we losing funding? Transportation. We basically are spending less on cash assistant welfare and transportation, and part of that is infrastructure spending that we might need to come back to. So why did they grow? Partly, state and local employment grew by 28% from 1992 to 2008, but if you look at it as a share of employment, it stayed constant. So there's been an increase in the size of the public workforce, but not as a share of the total workforce. And most of that growth has been in education and police and corrections. So those are the shares that have grown more than other places within state and local employment. Part of what's going on with education, there actually had been a decision to decrease class sizes. We've increased public sector salaries. We've also given public sector workers higher pension payments and benefits. We've expanded eligibility rules for health programs. So it's not to say that this expenditure is good or bad. Most of it is for things that people largely agree with. And if you ask people on the street whether they want smaller class sizes and to spend more on education, they would say yes. If you ask people whether you should insure people who need health insurance, they would probably say yes. It's just to point out the fact that this is where growth is going. And if we're going to make cuts, or if we're going to think about funding solutions, some of these areas are going to need to be considered. Pension funds. This, in some ways, is going to be the big question going forward. States increased pension benefits largely in the 1990s when these plans were overfunded, in part because of the stock market bubble. So basically, a lot of states found their pension funds were overfunded, so they basically expanded benefits and stopped making some payments. After the stock market crashed, pension benefits have been a little harder. Only about a third of states fully pay pension liabilities. The Pew Center of the States estimated that about 85% pensions are funded at about an 85% rate. New data out for 2008 also says that pensions are about funded at an 85% level, but that is reflecting through pension years 2008, which is before the stock market crash for most states, because most pension benefits budgets are done on a July to June schedule. So we're basically going to see this level of funding decline going forward over the next 5 years. Typically, state pension funds do some smoothing over a 5-year period, typically. And as the current downturn gets worked into those liabilities, there's going to be pressure to refund these pensions. The other thing that's a big question mark, non-pension retiree benefits. This is about $381 billion as of 2006. It's going to be bigger. But this is an area where states have been much less good about putting money away. There's been a change in rules where states now need to at least report what the size of these liabilities are because of changes in GASB rules. But we're going to see that this is going to be a big question mark for state budgets. How are they going to pay for these benefits? How are they going to pay for health care? How are they going to pay for the defined benefit plans that they've actually promised their workers? Other long-term pressures on state budgets. So if we go further out, we're going to come down to questions about what services governments want to provide. Are we going to basically be able to afford the increase in healthcare costs? And if we're not able to afford it, what do we do about it? Pension funds will need to be topped off. And there's been ongoing pressure to improve schools and increase per pupil spending. Even as student enrollments have fallen in the past, per pupil spending has actually increased, in part because of federal mandates, in part because of special education needs, and in part because we've actually decreased class sizes and increased compensation for teachers. So as we go forward, we're going to see a bunch of cuts in these services, but what is it going to mean? Will we restore them? The big driver behind why those healthcare costs are going up. If we look forward in terms of where the population is going, the population is growing, but the growth is largely in people who are over 65, and the percent of the population that's over 85 is going to triple. So we're getting older. In 1980, 11% of the population was 65 or over. In 2025, over 18% will be 65 or over, and these trends just continue. This is in part due to the aging of the baby boom and increased longevity. As I said before, there's a tripling in the over 85. That's going to be a group that's especially costly for states because Medicaid covers long-term care right now. And as we get more and more people over 85, the cost of providing some sort of care for them is going to increase. The other thing that isn't noted is we're getting younger. While the share of school-age children is going to decline, the actual number of kids is going to increase by 22% from 1980 to 2025. So part of this is the echo of the baby boom, and some of this is through immigration. This is uneven over time and across states, but for states that are actually finding they have more students, education is going to require funding. And so it's not really clear that you can have healthcare crowd out what we're spending on education. So what are states to do? I think the key is there's going to actually have to be some real discussion about what services should government provide. I'm going to say something now that I might get yelled at by the chancellor. States have raised higher ed tuition. Should students pay more? If you think that an education is something that gives you private returns, maybe actually letting students pay more isn't a terrible idea. California raised tuition to $10,000, but you're still getting what is sort of a AAA education, and you get some benefits from that. So maybe students should be made to pay more of the cost of their higher education. There's going to be need to do more infrastructure spending, but as we have to pay the debt on that, that puts pressure on budgets. California, which is everybody's poster child and the state I know best, just reported that because of the bond issues in 2006, they're estimating that 15% of their general fund budget is going to have to go for either increased pension payments or debt payments. So this is interest on debt coming from the general fund. If you know California and you know that 40% of the general fund needs to go to Prop 98 spending, you're getting more and more of your general fund money tied up in things that need to be spent, and it's not clear how you provide those other services. What do you do about pension systems? In the past, when the stock market was increasing dramatically, there was a big push to actually move some state workers from defined benefit to defined contribution plans. It seems like it's going to be a harder sell to increase the number of people who are facing income insecurity once we see what happened on the private sector with pensions. So I think there might be some room for budgeting or for salary negotiations, and I think there should be some acknowledgement of the fact that in the past there were lower salaries for public sector workers, but that was made up in part because of pensions and other stability in their jobs. There might be some opportunity where there can be negotiations with the unions or with public sector workers in terms of acknowledging the fact that they're getting a big retirement benefit, and maybe that can be reflected in salary discussions. What level of government should provide services? This is critical. Do we think that maybe the federal government should pay for health care? If we actually move to a system where the federal government is responsible for health care payments, that frees up money for state and local governments and takes what is one of the largest expenditure drivers off of their backs. There might need to be negotiations. Maybe it involves there being a federal VAT and limiting sales tax. On the other side, what services should local governments provide? Which services should states provide? And in some of the Northeast states, should there be consolidation of governments? Part of the problem when you get to a state like New Jersey, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, you have a lot of little governments providing services. That drives up costs. Is there a way that people can coordinate and consolidate? And is this the time to do some of that? So I don't really have any answers, but I'll just raise more questions for you.
When Bob asked me to come to respond to Kim's remarks at this meeting, he also told me that I was to provide solutions to the long-term state budget issue. And ever since then, I have been waiting for inspiration to strike. It's failed to do so, I'm sorry to tell you, but I do have a couple thoughts in response to what Kim has said. And first of all, she's given you such a splendid, comprehensive view of the state budget problem that I certainly don't have any intention of going back over the same subjects. One question is, where do we go from here? The Lieutenant Governor raised the point at the outset of his remarks, near the outset of his remarks, that people are not paying attention, that the crisis is there, and as he pointed out, for the state of New York in some detail, but I'd say for the rest of the states generally, the crisis has been building for some time. For roughly the past 20 years, we at NCSL, the National Governors Association, and other interstate organizations have been trying to convince legislators and governors, the policymakers, that there are structural problems with state tax systems that over time would lead, and I think we now see have led, to very serious state revenue issues. And over the past 20 years, we have been speaking to a largely deaf audience on that point. As the Lieutenant Governor said, handing out hearing aids, handing out text doesn't seem to do much to help out. That that states, through policy changes, have narrowed the tax base of the personal income tax, they've narrowed the base of the general sales tax, they've narrowed the base of the corporate income tax in ways that make those taxes more and more vulnerable to the economic cycle. And now we see, with a serious downturn in the cycle, that these issues are more pressing than ever. So there are long-term issues there. And I think we've also seen in the long term, looking back at the response of state governments to recessions in the past, that fundamental reform is very unlikely. It doesn't happen. What we see are piecemeal solutions. In times of prosperity, states tend to undermine some of the solutions they provided to their revenue problems in the wake of a fiscal crisis. I'm not particularly expecting to see dramatic change in how states deal with their fiscal issues, even in the wake of this very dramatic crisis. And this is a dramatic one. I was asked to do a couple things, not for this presentation in particular, but over the past year or so, asked to do a couple things to look at the long-term response of states to fiscal crises. And the first thing I'd say is that there never has been a crisis like this for state government. It's pointless to compare this to the Great Depression of the 1930s, because in the early 1930s, state government did very little. It had none of the domestic obligations that states took on, in part, in the course of the 30s and in the years since. And it's not even a fair comparison with the 1990-1991 crisis in state government, because at that time, two of the big issues that Kim has identified, the overhang of state pension obligations and the overhang of retiree health care obligations, weren't out there on the horizon. This is a new experience. One thing that looking at past experience of the states in recessions does show us is that the states probably are not at their low point yet. In the past 3 cycles of national recession, states' lowest point of reserves, of fiscal capacity, comes in about the second fiscal year after the end of the recession has been identified. So if we assume that this recession did end, as said, back in the early fall or the late summer, then we would be looking at the low point of state fiscal conditions in fiscal year 2012 out ahead of us. And that's when, traditionally also, states act to respond with revenue solutions and to some extent with spending cuts. So let's take a look at what has been going on so far. One of the things that we do in the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures is track, on the basis of information from the legislative fiscal offices, we track changes in state spending, we track changes in state revenues, and we ask for, as well as that quantitative information, we ask for qualitative assessments of where you think the state is, what is your outlook for the near term, what is your outlook for the long term. We've been doing this for more than a quarter of a century, since Steve Gold, who was mentioned earlier as having moved to the Rockefeller Institute many years ago, since Steve Gold instituted that program for us back in the early 1980s. We'll be releasing an updated report next week at a national meeting we're holding in San Diego, but we have some information, and I think it is telling. It's true, as Kim said, that there were significant tax increases in the 2009 legislative sessions in response to the crisis. When you look at the nature of those responses, though, it's not quite a 50 or even a 48 state response if you assume that there are 48 states in crisis. Almost 2/3 of the net revenue increases that were enacted were in 3 states, California, New York, and Florida. The rest of the states made, not all the states, about 3/4 of the states had some sort of tax increase or revenue increase this year, but most of them relatively minor. So in most states, raising revenue wasn't the response to this crisis. What the states did this year, what the legislatures and governors did this year, was follow the traditional pattern of muddling through with a variety of makeshift arrangements, the use of federal funds to forestall cutting budgets more deeply than otherwise, a number of budget cuts, as Kim has mentioned, and as we hope to document specifically state by state over the next couple of weeks, and a small amount of revenue increase. So state budgets overall probably fell for fiscal year 2011 from fiscal year 2010, but we don't have those numbers yet. We will soon. Does this mean that next year we'll see a facing of reality and an effort to make more substantial changes that would deal with the underlying cyclical problems and the underlying long-term revenue problems? I'm not expecting a great deal to happen in in calendar 2010 and the 2010 legislative sessions for the simple reason that in 46 of the states there are statewide elections next year. Many of them are electing governors. All of them are electing members of the House of Representatives, the equivalent of your assembly. All of them are electing at least part of their state senate. It won't be a good year for radical change on the revenue side. That's not something that happens in election years. But what I would suspect will happen then is that with less federal stimulus money to work with for the following year's budgets, and certainly with state revenues likely to continue to decline, that's the historic pattern as we're coming out of a recession. State revenues continue to decline until state employment starts to rise again. States are going to have less money, legislatures are going to have less money to appropriate the 2010 sessions than they had this year. And with revenue increases very difficult in an election year, with an additional federal stimulus package, I think very unlikely, we're going to see very, very deep budget cuts. We're going to see very deep reductions in state aid to local government. We're going to see very deep reductions in higher education in particular. But when you think back on the pie charts that Kim showed you, that half of state spending goes for Medicaid and education, then those budget cuts are going to have to extend into two sacrosanct areas of state spending. One of the things that we hear continually when we talk to legislators and legislative staff about what they're doing is that they're not going to touch K-12 education. K-12 education is sacred. I think 2010 is a year when we will see that resolve weaken, not because of a change of heart, but just because the numbers won't add up otherwise. I think we're going to see a very, very difficult budget year, a terrible year politically, a very nasty year. And we're also going to see, I would guess, the beginning of the answer to the Lieutenant Governor's question, is anybody really paying attention? I think next year is the year when people are going to start paying serious attention, because the budget cuts that we're going to see are going to force that upon them. And then I would think in the year or two after that, we will start to see some significant change in state priorities, in how states manage their budgets, in choices about what is spent, because that would follow inevitably. One of the hopeful signs presently is that there are a lot of meetings like this one going on around the country. That's a very good thing. An even better thing is that legislatures are holding budget study groups, tax study groups in places where this would have been thought unlikely in the recent past. The California Tax Commission report probably is going to be dead on arrival in the California legislature, but across the country, legislative interim committees, special study groups, budget study groups are aware of the kind of problems that you have seen laid out for you here today. They are working very hard at solutions. They're piling through the kind of material that we, the Urban Institute, the Rockefeller Institute, the Pew Center of the States, the kind of material that many, many well-informed and well-intentioned people have been preparing for many years. I think that we're going to see a very difficult year next year, economically, fiscally, and politically. But I think that will be the darkest part of this period, and that in the year or two after that, I think we're going to begin to see creative answers to questions about what state priorities should be, how responsibilities should be divided up, and how we can put state revenues on a more stable basis. Thank you.
Very good. We do have just a couple of minutes for questions for Kim and or Ron. And yes, sir. Please identify yourself if you would.
This is Joe Pangalosi with BlackRock. Do you have any sense, either one of you, do you have any sense of currently what percentage pensions and OPEBs are of state and local budgets? And in this, has there been any study if they went to 401k type or defined contribution benefits, what would the savings be over some period of time?
I don't know if there's been a study done of it. I know the Pew Center on the States is actually doing an update to their 2006 study that's supposed to be out in February, where they're going to go state by state. They're trying to get the 2009 numbers in there, which is why I think the study was delayed, which will be a first step in seeing how big the unfunded liabilities are. I think California's pension is like $185 billion. So they're big. Moving to a defined contribution system would I don't know if it would necessarily save any money in the beginning. It would just be explicit in who's paying the money. I think part of the problem with defined benefit plans is also the fact that you can have movement between different levels of government. If you look at some of the teacher pensions and some of the local government pensions, if you can get people who have fairly high seniority to retire, they're off your books. They're not off the total state and local budget books because you're giving them attractive retirement deals. So you could see that there is a difference in responsibility that might make it more transparent and at least make the numbers and how big the contributions are, because the defined contribution would come in at the same time that the worker is working, more transparent for states. The question about who should bear the risk, though, is the big one now. Do we think retirees, is the fact that we're moving from a defined benefit to a defined contribution system nationwide a good or a bad thing? And I think those are questions that different states are going to come up with different answers to.
I'd like to respond to that briefly, too. As Kim said, it's very unlikely that there would be short-term savings from a state moving its pension systems from defined benefit to defined contribution because of the accounting rules that require a very explicit method of funding the remaining unfunded liability of a closed defined benefit plan. That's one thing. And so what seems to have discouraged legislators in a number of states, one of the issues that's discouraged legislators in a number of states from pursuing a defined contribution plan is the fact that any savings would be 10, 15, maybe 20 years down the road, and one of the goals is, of course, to make some immediate savings. Those wouldn't show up. The other fact, too, that doesn't get much attention is it really depends on how you set up the defined contribution plan, whether there ever would be any savings whatsoever. A study from TIAA-CREF recommends that the employer-employee contribution for a defined contribution plan be in the nature of 12, 13% between the two of them. That's not that much different from the contribution level for defined benefit plans. So if you have the overhang of an unfunded liability, you have a continuing 12 or 13% contribution between the two parties. You really would go a long way into the future before you would see savings. Kim mentioned earlier the possibility of states changing, instead of pension and fringe benefits for employees, changing salary benefits, and I will report, without a recommendation, a creative solution in the state of Colorado, which is that 1.5% of next year's scheduled salary increase for state employees instead will go to the state retirement fund as an additional down payment on the unfunded liability. So it's in theory a salary increase. It is in practice an increase in their contribution to the state retirement system, which the state cannot statutorily require them to make, but it can divert salary to the system.
I think we will leave it at that. There will be more opportunities for anyone interested to speak with Kim and Ron over lunch or this afternoon. Please join me in thanking them.